Today, we're talking with Arikana Chihombori, the former ambassador of the African Union to the United States. Ambassador, it's such a pleasure to be with you again. I've always enjoyed our conversations and learned from them. And I just want to ask you, in the West, when you look at these countries, Mali, Chad, Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Gabon, Niger, the West looks at this like maybe there's a problem going on here. How do you look at it?
There is a serious problem for the West, for sure. I think the West did not see it coming. However, it was very naive of the Western nations to think that the exploitation of Africa was going to continue unabated forever. The West is definitely, if I may use a four-letter word, not so kind, they may be pissing in their pants, because what's happening in Africa is indeed a revolution, and a revolution that's way past due.
So you see it as a revolution, but what kind of revolution is it, in the sense that do you think this is throwing off repression from France, from the United States, from other nations? What kind of revolution do you see is underway?
Well, I like to think, if I were to use the biblical terms, this is a revelation among Black people. They're waking up and realizing that what has been happening is wrong, is wrong, is wrong, and change must come. And for true change to come, it must be brought by the people. What you are seeing is an African electorate that is now awoken, that is informed. They understand the real issues. In the past, Africans have been misinformed, misled, and given false information, and being thrown a shiny object and being told only the African heads of states are the problem. But now they understand the invisible hand and the role that the invisible hand is playing to make sure that Africa remains where they want Africa to be. The African heads of states, particularly those heads of states of the former French colonies, majority of them were just puppets put in place to continue the same French legacy, which basically boxed them in, where it said you have no control of your military, you have no control of your natural resources, you have no control of your finances, and if you continue from those three areas, you are free to rule your country any which way you want. What power does that president have? And in the past, any president that has tried to back the system and do something about taking control of the financial resources, and I'm talking about African countries depositing their bank reserves with France, I'm talking about African countries giving up their natural resources, no value addition, France having first right of refusal for all the natural resources discovered yet to be discovered, France companies having first right of refusal for all contracts, large, small, private, public, France having military presence in those countries, and France having the ability to invade them in the event that they feel their interests are being violated, France making sure that those countries can only be trained by France, the military can only be trained by France, the military equipment can only be bought from France. Come on now. Our people didn't understand all this. So we can change African heads of states in those former French colonies like we change clothes. If those fundamentals are not addressed, nothing is going to change. The Africans now understand where the real problem is. The real problem, like I've always said, the biggest risk to peace and security in Africa is France. Let's make no mistake about that. They still have a stronghold in Africa through their multinational companies that continue to siphon billions out of Africa every year. We are aware of that. But the biggest problem when it comes to former French colonies is France. Its roots are so entrenched in those countries, and now France is trying to expand into other nations. Until we address those agreements African countries were forced to sign, nothing, and I mean nothing we do, is going to bring us the true economic liberation, which is what Africa needs, which is what Africa was denied when African countries were being given their independence. We are now dealing with an African electorate that understand what is really going on in Africa.
Well, let me ask you, Ambassador, let's take Niger for a moment. President Mohamed Bazoum is a popular president in the West. You know, the IMF liked him, the World Bank liked him, the United States liked him, France seemed to like him. I would like our listeners to understand the gap in the popularity of someone like President Bazoum and performance, and what is going on that makes that revolution, that coup as we see it in Niger, a different story than we're seeing.
The performance that you're talking about is the performance of what Nigerian minerals are doing to French education, to French healthcare, to French infrastructure. You tell me, why is it that 95% of Nigerian uranium is powering over 30% of France, while over 70% of Nigerians have no electricity? How is that okay? How is even President Bazoum proud of himself with that fact? There is no development in Niamey. I was in Niamey a few years ago when we had the AU summit. It was pitiful to see the level of underdevelopment that Niger has. There is no development in Niger. Let's make no mistake about it. Niger is the second poorest country in Africa, in the world, in fact. So how can President Bazoum be proud of himself? What development is he talking about? You're talking about developing France? There is no development in Niger, one of the poorest countries on earth. And of course, IMF would love them. World Bank would love them. France would love him because he is allowing the pilferage, the exploitation to continue. And that's why the people are rising up to say, if you can't stand up to the bullies and tell them that the exploitation can no longer continue, and look President Macron in the face and say, President Macron, how is it okay that my money, my bank reserves, my natural resources are funding French education, are funding French healthcare, are funding French infrastructure? How is that okay, President Macron? Answer us. Africans in Niger, they want to know. So when you tell me that he is favored by the West, it makes sense. But he's definitely not favored by the people because there is no development. Let's be serious here. Let's stop pushing lies about what's happening. They know the exploitation is happening. It's happening in Niger. It's happening in Burkina Faso. It's happening in Mali. It's happening in every African country. Let's make no mistake about this. We're sick and tired of giving up our lunch to Western nations. African children, they need to eat too. African children need to go to school. African children need good healthcare systems. Behind all that abuse, we need to let the Western world know that there are millions of African children who are going hungry, millions of African children who are dying, millions of women, African women who are dying giving birth to another life, millions of African youth who are unemployed, all because the Western world is continuing with the agenda of exploitation, and exploitation of the African continent. That era is over. Well, and we're coming together as Africans and saying, enough is enough. This has got to stop.
From a practical viewpoint, and I just want to challenge you for a minute, I think a lot of people in France who might say, hey, we've got to do something, we have an obligation to do something, see their resources as necessary. How do you get it right? Because if you go to no resources coming into these countries, is that okay? Or what would you advise those in the international development field to begin using as their North Star in how to get this equation right so that Africa can grow on its own terms, but that it's not necessarily cut off from the rest of the world?
I think that's a very important question you're asking, Steve. We're not asking that the Western countries we should just cut them off. No. We're saying the parasitic relationship that these Western countries have with African countries has got to come to an end. We are simply saying we do not need aid, we need trade. They must come to Africa, treat us with respect, treat us as equals. You take, for example, Niger is selling its uranium to France for 80 cents a kilo, when the rest of the Western countries are buying the same uranium at $200, 200 euros per kilo. It is amazing. Over 99% of the value of their uranium is going to France and other Western nations. Value that should be coming to Niger. That is wrong. It is thievery of the highest order. We're simply saying, come to Africa and treat Africans fairly. Trade with Africans fairly, just like you trade with other nations. And yes, sir, we need foreign direct investment. We need our Western allies, but our Western allies must understand Africans are humans too. Their needs are just as important as the needs of those citizens of the Western nations.
Ambassador, we're talking a lot about France, in part because these coups and the changes in government are happening in all the countries that were part of the French colonial history in Africa and that whole story. But, you know, some of the other big players in the world may be complicit in some of this as well. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the United States and how it gets it right, on Russia, on China, all of which are major players chasing these same minerals and same assets in Africa. Are you worried that some of the patterns and habits of the past are going to just be reinvented and that exploitation continue with China, Russia, the United States, or do you see any of them doing it better than the others?
I think now that they realize that they can no longer continue to exploit the African, I would advise all of them that this is again time, like I used in my last interview with you, that it's time for all of them to call for timeout if this was a basketball game. Now, I'm going to start with the United States. The United States is actually in a very interesting position when it comes to their relationship with France. France is like a wounded shark. France is like a wounded elephant. You know, like the going says, when you are swimming with the sharks, when one starts to bleed, you get out of the water. My advice to the United States would be, France is bleeding really, really badly. France is wounded really, really badly when it comes to its relationships with Africa. So I would advise the United States to get out of the water, distance yourself from France, because you do not want the negative sentiment, really bad sentiment that the Africans have about France to bleed over to you, the United States, who I still feel that they're in a very good position to take a leading role in their relationships and trade relationships with Africa. So to the United States, I say, France is bleeding, get out of the water. To the rest of the other nations, they've already picked up and realized on it. China, for example, China picked up on the mistakes that were being made by the Americans, the mistakes that were being made by the European nations, and China was coming into Africa realizing that, for example, when it comes to funding, European nations would talk and talk and talk about funding. They'll talk about building an airport. They'll talk about building a bridge. 10 years later, there is no bridge. There is no airport. It's still talk. All kinds of roadblocks and red tapes are put in order to access funding. So China decided we'll make it easy for African countries to access funding. So that's why you'll find a lot of infrastructure projects are being built by China, because they realize where the Americans, the Europeans, are dropping the ball, and they're coming in with a different strategy. And therefore, it has been easier for China to woo the Africans to their side because they're doing things differently from what the Americans and the Europeans are doing. So to the United States, I say, look at the mistakes that France has made. Do something different. Revisit your American policy when it comes to Africa. And the United States still stands a very good position to win the Africans over, but this time, win them the right way. Treat them fairly. And no more playing games, no more divide and conquer. Stay away from the local politics. You do not need to get involved. Let these African countries dog it all out, one child to the other. I like to say opposition parties, ruling parties, they are children of the same mother fighting for their breast milk. Let them fight for their mother's breast milk alone, without interference. So the U.S. is very good at interfering with electoral processes in Africa. That's a bad precedent, because sooner or later everybody is figuring it out.
Right.
Then you become the enemy. So stop it. Stay out of local politics. To Russia, again, Russia is looking and saying, where is the West going wrong? They are coming in, they see a weakness. Russia came in during the liberation wars in Southern Africa, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mozambique, Angola, all those African countries that attained independence through liberation wars. Russia and China came in and realized that the Western world were on the wrong side of the equation. So they came in to say, if we're going to go and win these people over, let's support their struggles, because truly, Russia came in to support these African nations when they really needed help. So you can't blame them. They found an opening, and they supported a cause that was just, that was right, that was needed. And therefore, you see that Russia is being accepted because of what they have done in the past, historically. So people are not going to forget the friends that came in when they were needed.
Right.
It's about looking at what's going on. But when it's all said and done, we're saying to the world, no more can you continue to exploit the Africans. Right. The Africans, we have gone through centuries of being stupid, of being ignorant, of being dumb, of allowing the world to just piss all over us. Well, that period is over. Africans are saying, we now know what is really going on. And if you truly want to be an African leader that's going to survive this revolution, you have to be an African leader that is anti-imperialism, an African leader that is anti-neocolonization, an African leader that's going to stand with the people in their pushback against the West, against the East, and anybody else that thinks they can come to Africa and exploit us. They can no longer walk all over us anymore.
Ambassador, when you and I spoke in December 2022, it was a great show and a great discussion. And at that time, you said that America and the White House were not showing African leaders respect, that they did not share agendas, that this was continued policies of racism and neglect, etc. Do you feel like any progress has been made in America's orientation towards some of the issues you raised since last December?
Well, I like it. Let me take you back to the visit to Africa by Vice President Kamala Harris. You know, it was quite interesting that with all the issues that were going on in Africa, for example, when she went to Zambia, there were mudslides that were killing hundreds of people next door to Malawi. She did not go to Malawi, did not even mention Malawi, but spent a lot of time in Zambia trying to push an LGBTQ agenda, an agenda that Africans across the continent are saying it's really not an issue for us. We have more important things to worry about, but Vice President Harris spent a lot of time on the LGBTQ. I'm not saying it's not an important issue, but when it comes to the greater scheme of things, the Africans are telling you that this is not a priority for us. We grew up with people who were trans. I remember growing up in my village, we had men who looked feminine. They would hang around women. They did their thing. Nobody cared. We had women who lived with women. We called them spinsters, and nobody cared. You know, I grew up seeing people who were clearly gay looking, and it was never an issue. So the Africans are telling you that it's not a primary issue to us. Stay away from it. But she did not listen to them. She kept pushing that agenda, you know. So it's like, we don't care what you think. We are going to tell you what you need to do. That was disappointing. That trip from Vice President Kamala Harris was very disappointing. And I've spoken to a lot of heads of states, a lot of African citizens. They were very disappointed with her position.
Well, let me ask you finally, Ambassador, you've talked about the people and that these are in many cases, popular revolutions. Do these military leaders really represent the people? You know, who do you see as the real standouts that can bring a plan, that can bring a strategy, and actually make this popular revolution as you see it successful and to get traction?
That's a very important question. And I would like to caution Africans as well. As we go through these coups, let's take, for example, what happened in Gabon. I had warned everybody to say, push back a little bit. Don't be quick to equate what's happening in Gabon to what's happening in Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali and Guinea. Each situation is different. The dynamics within the quote-unquote coup, which I call revolution, are different. Yes, we like to see change, but not every general means well for the people. The Gabon situation, you got some family issues there. I don't want to go there. So we have to look at it and say, of the three parties, let's dissect them, let's unbundle them. We have the president. We have the wife with the president's wife as well. We got to take a look at her with a critical eye. Then we have the general himself, who is a family member. Then we have the sister to the deposed president, who is siding with the general. Then we have, of course, the opposition party, who now feels betrayed. So there's a different dynamic in the Gabon issue that before we bundle it all up, you look at even the manner in which the general was dressed when he was being sworn in. He looked like a Frenchman, very Western. So we have to understand each situation very differently. But I would say, in my humble opinion, the sentiment coming out of Burkina Faso, out of Mali, out of Niger, that is the sentiment and the solidarity that we are looking for. Those who are clearly standing up and denouncing neocolonization, denouncing imperialism, demanding that exploitation of the continent can no longer continue. That is a common message that's coming out of those countries. I am not getting that out of Gabon, which makes me wonder, who is really behind the coup in Gabon? We need to understand that. Why is the general shying away from that sort of strong message to the people? Because that is what Africa is ready for right now. That is what the revolution that's taking place in Africa is all about. Any leader that does not stand for anti-imperialism, anti-neocolonization, anti-continued exploitation of the continent, that is a leader that the Africans are not going to support, be it a military leader or a civilian leader.
Well, Adikana Chihombori Kwao, former ambassador to the African Union.